So the relevance of Lloyd-Jones for us today.
Tim, here you and I sit, two pastors who never knew Lloyd-Jones personally.
Right.
So why are we good ones to talk about the relevance of Lloyd-Jones for pastors today?
We've been influenced by him, and we also, I don't know anyone at all who doesn't have to sift through Lloyd-Jones for various things, because he was actually rather idiosyncratic. I mean, he really wasn't like anybody else.
Yeah.
And he had lots and lots of extremely strong views on almost everything. Like
Can you imagine a major preacher in an English-speaking city today who's idiosyncratic and has strong views and he's not like anyone else? Wow. Can you imagine the Lord blessing a ministry like that?
Another way to put it is that I remember old Lyle Schaller. Remember Lyle Schaller?
Of course.
Who just
Recently died.
Yeah. He used to say that every large church, the larger the church, the more it becomes unique. Meaning, it's not like other large churches. He would really say, a church of 3,000 is not like other churches of 3,000 because they're almost like different planets. I do think that may be the case with great preachers too. That most great preachers I know are really not at all like any other great preacher. And so, if you're going to learn from any great preacher, you can't possibly just be a clone.
Weren't you the one yesterday at the conference we've been at talking about rings?
Yes.
Use that. That's a good image.
Well, when you cut a tree down, you see it has a bunch of rings. And I do think that good preachers, especially great preachers, have had so many different influences and have learned from so many different folks that they, in the end up finding their own voice. I would say that if you have one major influence, you're a clone. If you have two major influences, you're a schizophrenic. And if you have about 10, they sort of pass into you. I do remember, you'll like this, I think I maybe told you this, I had a George Whitefield year in which I was reading everything he'd ever, I read his biography, I read about 70 of his sermons, and I was very inspired because he was so in your face, so evangelistic. But at one point, Kathy said to me, you're sounding a little bit, and I said, what do you mean? I said, well, I'm afraid one of these days you're going to accidentally say "methinks," and so. Then I went through that, and I went into. So I do think that in a way, Whitefield is actually a ring in my preaching, but I'd say Lloyd-Jones is a pretty thick ring.
Ed Clowney's another ring in your preaching.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Big ring.
Yeah, a very big ring.
So Ed Clowney is someone who I met personally, I didn't know him, but I've benefited from his biblical theology, his biblical preaching.
Yeah.
How is Lloyd-Jones different than that? I think a lot of young guys today may think, okay, here's another guy, he's reformed in his soteriology, he knows God saves us unilaterally. How is his preaching different than, say, just good biblical theological preaching?
I mean, Lloyd-Jones now?
Yeah.
Well, Lloyd-Jones was always gospel-oriented, but not necessarily always what we might call Christocentric. That is to say, he would preach an Old Testament text, for example, and he would get to the gospel basics. He would get to sin and grace and forgiveness and the cross. He'd get there, but not necessarily by finding the Old Testament theme and drawing it out to Christ.
Right.
He would just cut to Jesus at the end.
Well, you can tell he was very self-educated when it came to theological matters.
Yeah.
And you can see him develop over the years.
Right.
He has his regeneration phase early on. Then he clearly reads Warfield. He comes to understand justification better. And his preaching in the 40s and 50s gets even clearer. So when you get to his great series on Ephesians and Romans, you have great doctrinal clarity along with that power that was there early on in his sermon.
If you read his evangelistic sermons from Sandfields, that's when he was really quite pointed on, you must be born again. But there's
not a lot behind it.
No, there's not much else to it.
Yeah.
So the other thing one of the things that I learned a great deal from him is that when I moved to New York, I listened to a lot of his messages and his recorded messages. One of the things I discovered was he always started every sermon the same, every time.
Sort of diagnostically.
Well, no. Really, at the very beginning, he said, I should like to call your attention this morning to the words of the Apostle Paul. Or I should like to call your attention this evening to the second chapter of, he always said, I should like to call your attention this morning or this evening. Always started like that. And if it was an evening sermon, he deliberately was thinking about, he was spending a lot of his mind on non-Christians present. He was assuming that a lot of non-Christians were there. It was an evening service.
Yeah.
He asked people to bring non-Christians to it. As you probably know, lots of members of other churches would come out in the evening and bring non-Christian friends because, frankly, he was a more powerful preacher. And he was somebody that you would bring a non-Christian to hear, even if it wasn't your pastor.
That's when Packer would go to hear him on Sunday evening.
That's right. And those evening sermons had a big impact on me when I listened to them because they were very expository and they were theological and they were very often in the Old Testament. And it wasn't the kind of evangelism that I had ever really thought of as a preacher. I tended to think of evangelism as more get to the cross. I mean, he was, the way in which he preached the gospel from Naaman, in 2 Kings 5, or even he does a series on Genesis 3 that's wonderful from the 1950s, and the questions of God after the fall. He comes and he counsels you and he asks you these questions. He says, "Where are you?" Of course, he knows where they are. Well, what's that mean? And they were brilliant, and they taught me how to preach evangelistically every week in a big city setting, but at the same time, was still doing exposition. I mean, still doing theological exposition. So I learned a lot from that.
His book, Preaching Preachers, I think is also a useful book for people to read. So, if you've not read Preaching and Preachers, you might want to look at it. It's lectures he gave at Westminster Seminary in 1968, I think.
I think so.
And they are opinionated.
Boy, are they ever.
And he's often right.
Yeah. But where is he wrong? Because I think you've written an essay, have you not, on where we don't follow Lloyd-Jones?
Sounds like it. Can't remember it. Sounds likely.
Well, I mean, he, by the way, one interesting thing is he did not believe in sermon titles at all.
No, he didn't. He didn't believe in planning ahead.
No.
I put out a sermon card where I tell you the messages, the texts are going to be dealt with for the coming 4 months.
He would never do that.
He loathed that because he would see that as quenching the spirit.
He did, absolutely.
Yeah.
In fact, even the length of time.
Yeah.
And sometimes he felt like if the Lord was, he made sure people did not expect, and he really frowned on people who, hey, the time is up.
Yeah.
You stay. If he was there, you stayed there till he was done. Well,
and even with the editing, you can tell when you read some of his early sermons in Romans or Ephesians, when he's in those, hello sections, when Paul's introducing himself, he'll just linger for a while. There'll be a second sermon and then a third sermon. As you can tell, more things have come to his mind that he wants to say and cover.
When he was, but what Packer said, and here's another thing I learned from him, was that I do see some ministers try to be passionate. So they start off and they're passionate like that. Lloyd-Jones always started quietly.
Yeah, that's right.
He started quietly, and he was very matter of fact. He was serious, but very matter of fact. And I listened to enough of these to know that sometimes the Spirit did not necessarily come upon him in any special way. There was always a certain grand, he got to the end, he got to the cross, he got to the gospel. But sometimes the Spirit did take hold of him, and the sense of the presence of God is very, very strong. And it just never sounded forced at all. And I realized that I couldn't try to be moved, or I couldn't try to be grand. I had to be moved by the Spirit at the text and at the truth that I had in front of me. And I couldn't. It would have to be completely genuine, and because you could just see it in him. But the sense of God and God's presence was very, very strong.
I think when you feel the grandeur of what you're dealing with, you're then in the beginning point of feeling that in your own preaching. And Lloyd-Jones just has that all the time. I remember Packer saying that he thinks he never felt the presence of God so much as when listening to Lloyd-Jones preach at Westminster Chapel.
That's right.
And I think part of that also showed itself in his steadiness. I remember his daughter, Elizabeth Catherwood, telling the story of when the bomb falls while he's preaching.
Yes.
Across the street or something, it falls. And don't think any glass breaks, but definitely the building shakes and some
dust.
plaster and dust comes down,
right.
and he's up there in the pulpit.
There was a pause because there was a pause to make sure there wasn't going to be
that's right.
some kind of
Something
collapse.
collapsing. That's right.
But as soon as it was clear,
the little man comes up and he dusts off Dr. Lloyd-Jones' shoulders,
and on he went,
and he just keeps preaching.
A bomb, and the bomb was like 2 blocks away or something.
Oh, it was closer than that. I think it was like across the street.
He just kept on going.
He paused and then just kept preaching because I think he felt the grandeur of what he was doing. Yeah.
He was unique, but it would be wrong for anybody who's I think today who really wants to be an effective preacher not to learn as much as possible from Dr. David Martyn Lloyd-Jones.
3 books to look at real quick: his Preaching and Preachers, his Studies in the Sermon on the Mount, and his book Spiritual Depression, which is badly named, I think, but it's a wonderful book on justification and the outworking of justification, and in some ways Christian freedom in the Christian life.
Yeah. Old Testament evangelistic sermons are pretty interesting too.
They're interesting, yeah.